Hey guys! Well, with it being the month of July and Pioneer Day approaching, after considering everyone's input, it looks like the next book that we're going to read is the biography of my ancestor, Elizabeth Mills Oakton Whitaker. Now, if you live in Davis County, especially Centerville, you've probably driven past her home, whether you realized it or not. And you might just find that you yourself have some connections to some of the people in this story. Now, to give you sort of a preface of how I came across this book and why I'm sharing it in today's video, for those of you who don't know, this book right here is what got me into family history several years ago. I had just had my first baby and I had a lot of time on my hands being at home with a baby that sleeps all the time. So I remember cleaning out a closet and this book happened to be on the shelf. I had never seen it before. I didn't know what it was. And it turns out my grandma's sister had been passing through. She had given this book to my mom to give to someone else in our family. Somehow my mom brought it to my house and it ended up with me and I didn't know what it was. So I remember sitting down one day while my baby was sleeping in my arms. I was sitting in a rocking chair in the living room by the window. I can still remember it vividly today. And I cracked this book open and just began to read. And I started to notice the pictures in the back. And I read that they were nearby in Davis County, which is where I live. And immediately I had a fascination and I felt a connection with this book and this ancestor. I had no idea that one of my great-great-great-grandmothers was a renowned pioneer and that she had a museum and a book written about her. I had no idea. And in that moment, when I made this connection, I thought to myself, how is it I'm related to some pretty incredible people and no one has ever told me? And then I realized this is on the side of my family who all left the church when I was younger, about junior high or so. A lot of them moved out of Utah and didn't want to have anything to do with any part of the culture that reminded them of the church, especially family history. And I remember times I would call up my grandma and I would ask her about her memories and just anything she could tell me about her childhood growing up, what her memories were of this grandmother of hers, and she never wanted to talk about it. I also remember learning that people believed that her son, which is my great-great-grandfather, had committed suicide. And after reading this book and reading the newspaper clipping and his obituary, I was able to piece together the story of what really happened and came to learn that it was an accident. Anyways, as I was going through this whole process, I went out to the museum one day and I took my little baby with me and we got the grand tour. And I remember the lady working that day said, "Oh my goodness, you are a descendant of William?" So I don't want to give anything away before we get into the story. So as we go, I'm going to sort of add some commentary with each chapter to things I learned after the fact of reading those chapters. So it should be pretty awesome. But anyways, she said she'd been doing this for years and she had never met a descendant from Elizabeth's first son, which was a really big deal. So she got my name, my phone number, my information, told me about this family reunion that they have all the time. And it happened to be that they were having one that year. So we got invited and I think we went to just a little part of it. And we bought some DVDs and some things that they had made celebrating their family history. And I remember watching the DVD and it showed a lot of the descendants from her other children. And I realized they were people in my ward that I had grown up with during childhood. We were related. There was their pictures in that family video, so it was kind of funny. It's a small world. But anyways, about a year later, this woman reached out to me and she said, someone new has taken over the museum and she's throwing away all the biographies. We used to sell them, but she found a little bit of mold on one of the books and so she tossed them all in the garbage. She said it about crushed my heart. So I went and secretly took them out of the garbage and I'm bringing them to you because I don't know who else to give them to. please don't tell anyone I've done this. And hopefully you can make use of them or restore them. So I remember at the time there was a man in my ward who was a microbiologist, and he took one of the books to his lab and inspected it and said it was just a little bit of mildew, the books were just fine. And so I've preserved all of these books since and have done my best to take care of them so we can keep them in the family. But anyways, this book is written by Elizabeth's granddaughter, Nora Whitaker Barber Miles. And she wrote this book, or at least she started writing it, before Elizabeth passed away in the 1930s. And so Nora had been collecting these notes, this information. She had been doing these interviews with Elizabeth in her old age. And then after she passed away, she began to write the book. I just realized I had my microphone turned off the entire time. So I've just turned it on. Hopefully that's made quite a difference. Anyways, the author of this book, Nora Whitaker Barber Miles, decided to tell Elizabeth's story in the form of like a fiction romance novel. So I've never really been into romance novels. I never read fiction. So I always laugh at myself that I wrote a fiction novel because I never read fiction. And so it was quite entertaining to read this. She adds quite a bit of detail. And then at the end of the book, you can read the entire interview and word for word her questions and Elizabeth's answers. So when we get to that point, I'll ask if that's something you're interested in me reading or if you just want me to be finished when the last chapter ends. I will say that there is a little bit of light profanity and extra descriptive words that don't need to be there. So I feel more comfortable changing the wording at some points in the book. I'm going to tone some parts down just a bit to make it a better experience for all. Better for younger ears that might be listening. Because this was written way back in the 30s, told by an ancestor of mine who grew up in the 1800s, I will say, according to today's standard, a lot of things in this book would be deemed politically incorrect and possibly a little offensive. So just wanted to give you a heads up in case you're extra sensitive to those things. Just remember that this story truly took place in the 1800s and comes from the perspective of that time period. So having said all of that, let's get started. There's just a little introduction at the beginning. It says, being lost at sea, her life in Nauvoo of crossing the plains, her great love affair, how it ended, and her life in polygamy, which she hated. Then her life in Centerville, Utah, how she raised the first silkworms and wove the first silk in Utah. The birth and sketches of her 12 children, her great love of Centerville, and of her dearest friend Mary Ricks Smith. Of how she loved to do exquisite handwork and used it to supplement her income. How she hated the nickname Lizzie, so we agreed to call her Sarah. And oh, so much more. Just read and find out. I think I'll skip over the acknowledgments and just get right into the chapter. Chapter 1. Sarah climbed from the back of the wagon onto the front seat by her father. Snuggling closely, she rested her cheek on his shoulder as her eyes swept the distance ahead. The rough wagon trail twisted and turned, losing itself finally in the rolling hills beyond. "Do you think they'll find a campsite, Father?" she asked. "The Scouts? I hope so. We all need a rest after the way we've been traveling the past few days." He turned his head and looked back at the train of ox teams and covered wagons following his lead. He could not see the end of the line, partly because of its length, and partly because of the winding trail. The lazy clouds of dust rising constantly from beneath the turning wheels, like fog rolling in from the ocean, further obscured his vision. He turned back, his shoulders sagging wearily. "How's your mother?" he asked. "Head still pretty bad?" "Yes. She dislikes traveling as much as I like it. She says if we ever do reach the valley, she hopes we never have to climb into a covered wagon again. She's resting now, though. She and Carrie dozed off, so I came out here with you. As she spoke, the girl beside him raised her head, stretching it from side to side to ease the tired muscles of her neck and back. The whole company, man and beast alike, were dust-laden and weary-eyed. Several days before, they had found directly in their path the dismembered bodies of 2 white trappers. The severed heads had been scalped and perched grotesquely on the horns of a huge buffalo skull. This meant that the Indians were seeking revenge against the whites for some wrong they had suffered. Hoping to avoid any trouble with the red men, the Mormon pioneers stopped only long enough to bury the 2 strangers, then hastened to put all possible distance between themselves and the angry Indians. Sarah's father, Captain Mills, had conferred with his scouts earlier in the day and had sent them ahead to look for a suitable campsite. They had seen no sign of Indians for the past 3 days, so felt reasonably safe in calling a halt. "Look!" cried the girl. "There they come now." She pulled off her sunbonnet and waved it to the 3 approaching horsemen. "They have found a place! I know they have!" she exclaimed. "Look how pleased Charles is!" "Since when has he been Charles to you, Sarah?" She did not miss the stern note in her father's voice, and though her color deepened, she met his eyes squarely. "Now, Father, stop worrying. I know he's not a Mormon, but after all, he's a perfect gentleman and very nice. Besides, we do owe him something. Remember, he saved my life less than 2 weeks ago, or I wouldn't be here now, sitting beside you." I know, but—" "I can take care of myself," she interrupted, drawing herself up with a mixture of pride and determination, yet with defiance, for she adored her father. "Then see that you do. It would break your mother's heart and mine if you ever took up with an outsider. You're all we have left, you and Carrie. Losing Tom was harder on your mother than any of us realized at first. Next to me, you're the one she leans on and looks up to. She wasn't made for this sort of life. She can't stand much more. Like a delicate flower, she requires the best of care in order to survive." She reached over and took the hand resting nearest her on the seat and pressed it between her smooth, strong fingers. "I'd never do anything to hurt either of you," she said earnestly. "The gospel means as much to me as it does to you. When I marry, it shall be for time and eternity." He gave her hand an answering squeeze, but the lines in his forehead deepened, and his heart swelled with tenderness, pride, and an uncontrollable yearning toward this, his firstborn, his favorite child. They were very close. Each knew and understood the other perfectly. It had always been so between them, this feeling of unity and oneness. In times of stress, each depended on the strength of the other and was not found wanting. But there was no time now to say all that was in his heart about his hopes and fears for her future. The returning scouts demanded his attention. They wheeled their horses around and walked them beside the lead wagon. "What luck, boys? Find any good place ahead?" Mills asked, raising his voice so that it could be heard above the crunching sound of the wagons. "Best place we found since leaving the Platte, sir," answered Charles Oakes, foremost of the 3 horsemen. He was a young man in his middle 20s. Though his voice was seriously courteous, Sarah caught the swift, penetrating look he gave her when mentioning the river, and she knew what was in his mind. It was there that he had rescued her from drowning. Afterward, they had actually seen each other for the first time. Oakes was not a Mormon, but a scout, hired by them as a guide. He had been over this country before and was familiar with the best campsites and watering places. He had determined, before the journey began, to have nothing but business dealings with these people. No Mormon was going to preach religion to him. Sure, they'd had a raw deal, but they'd brought it on themselves, preaching polygamy and practicing it in this enlightened day and age. Not to mention all the other divine rights they claimed to possess. He wanted no part of it. Then he met Sarah, a slip of a girl not yet 15, yet with the body of Venus, and a spirit to challenge his own reckless daring. Still, his attitude toward the fanatical Mormons had not changed. He told himself fiercely, not toward the Mormons as a whole, only toward one of their members. He sighed unconsciously and looked away from her to escape the mad, whirling thoughts that filled his brain. He fought against the attraction, for he knew how devout these people were. Besides, he didn't want to become involved with them in any way. But the thought of her drew him as the thirsty flow draws rain. His eyes stole back to the red gold hair hanging in twin braids over her full, enticing chest. Gosh, what beauty, what lips, what eyes! Every night for the last 3 weeks, since he had held the weight of her limp body in his arms and carried it to safety, he had seen her, caressed her in his dreams. Women! Heck! No dang woman was going to make a fool out of him. He wrenched his thoughts back to the present. "Shall we pass the word along, sir?" he inquired. "How much farther is it?" "About 2 miles. We can make it before sunset if we keep moving." "Fine. Tell them." It's just what they need to cheer them up. Much of the fatigue seemed to drop from the dust-laden faces and bloodshot eyes of the company as the good news spread that they were to camp and sleep through the night. Soon they were singing to shorten the last stretch of the day's journey. First from one wagon, then the one next, and so on, until a mighty chorus of 200 voices singing in unison filled the air. The song was their favorite. "Come, come ye saints, no toil nor labor fear, but with joy wend your way. Though hard to you this journey may appear, grace shall be as your day. 'Tis better far for us to strive, our useless cares from us to drive. Do this, and joy your hearts will swell. All is well, all is well. Why should we mourn, or think our lot is hard? 'Tis not so, all is right. Why should we think to earn a great reward, if we now shun the fight? Gird up your loins, fresh courage take. Our God will never us forsake. And soon we'll have this truth to tell, all is well, all is well. We'll find the place which God for us prepared, far away in the west, where none shall come to hurt or make afraid. There the saints will be blessed. We'll make the air with music, shout praises to our God and King. Above the rest these words will tell, all is well, all is well. And should we die before our journey's through, happy day, all is well. We then are free from toil and sorrow too. With the just we shall dwell. But if our lives are spared again, to see the saints their rights obtain, oh, how we'll make this chorus swell, all is well, all is well. There was something about their singing that always stirred Charles. Yet somehow he couldn't put his finger on just what it was, but it was there, shimmering through the music, like a rainbow in a clean-washed sky, beyond his reach. They reached the campsite a little before sunset. The wagons were placed to form a circle, the tongue of each interlocked in the hind axle of the one in front of it, forming a corral for the animals. The scouts had chosen well. This was indeed a lovely spot, lying at the foot of a ravine surrounded by trees and thick-growing shrubs. A fresh stream of water flowed down the ravine. Its banks were soon lined with stooping figures bathing dust from parched hands and faces. Thirsty cattle drank long and gratefully, then were taken back and locked into the corral of wagons. The women set to work preparing supper. Each family built a fire close to its own wagon and hung a black kettle over it. Presently, the pungent odor of cooking food filled the air, whetting the already hearty appetites of the campers. The main fare was jerked buffalo stew with hot soda biscuits, baked in heavy iron Dutch ovens. Sarah made several trips to the stream for water. The last time she sat down beside it, bathing her face anew and drinking from her cupped hands. She leaned back, luxuriously filling her lungs with the fresh, cool air. This was a restful place, so pleasant after the tedious monotony of riding. Not that she minded traveling, she liked nothing better, but one did get a little tired sometimes of the dust and constant bumping over rough roads. Something in the air behind her stirred. She felt rather than heard it. She whirled and looked searchingly in every direction. She could see nothing in the twilight but the silent trees. A chill crept up her spine, for even though not a breath of sound or movement greeted her, she was sure someone had been there spying on her. Perhaps an Indian. The memory of the 2 murdered white men flashed through her memory. She got to her feet and walked swiftly back toward the camp. A huge bonfire had been kindled. That meant there would be dancing after the regular prayer and singing. Fear left her. She felt secure in the warmth and safety of the camp. By the time the meal was finished, the big fire was at its best. Those not wishing to dance sat around on rugs and buffalo robes watching the fun, sometimes clapping in time to the music or singing the words to the songs being played. John Mills and his wife sat watching the dancers. "Feel up to a Virginia reel, Martha?" he asked. "Not tonight. I'd rather just watch," she answered. Then presently she added, "You'd think they'd be too tired to dance like that, wouldn't you?" "It's a rest and a change for them," he laughed. "Young folks can stand anything. They look forward to this hour of relaxation. It helps them to keep going during the day." "I suppose so. John, isn't that Sarah dancing with our scout? See, way over there next to the last set?" "Yes, I've been watching them. First time I've seen him take part in our recreation. But he's certainly no amateur. Handles himself perfectly. And Sarah's having the time of her life. I hope he doesn't try getting serious with her. He isn't a Mormon, you know. Let her enjoy herself, my dear." He covered her hand with his. "She's a sensible girl and knows what she wants. I'd trust her anywhere, and I want her to be happy. When we go out west, I want her to go to school, then nursing perhaps. She's wonderful around the sick. Yes, Sarah would make a fine nurse, though how anyone would choose that as a profession is beyond me. But Sarah's different. Nothing seems to upset her. We must try to keep her from marrying too young, or becoming a plural wife to an older man. She's too intelligent, too independent for that sort of thing. She must have a young man, someone near her own age, with similar tastes, or she will be miserably unhappy. There seems to be few younger men to choose from, at least in this company. Most of them are men with families. Some have 2 wives already." "True, but there's plenty of time. Sarah's young. By the time she's older and ready to settle down, the right man will find her. She looks so much older than she is, and her speech and manner give the impression that she's in her 20s. She's always been mature for her years, but our experiences of the past few years have made an even greater difference. Scarcely a week goes by anymore, but some brother or other approaches me in the hope of making her a 2nd or 3rd wife. It always infuriates me somehow. It is the one thing I couldn't endure. Polygamy and Sarah would never mix. Never." As they talked, the dancers swung back and forth in the firelight, the girls humming and the men whistling to the rhythmic music of violin and guitar, while High Thompson called the dances. "Swing your partner! Grand right and left! Circle all!" At exactly 9 o'clock the signal was given to stop dancing. They all gathered around the fire and sang one verse of "We Thank Thee, O God, for a Prophet." A short but fervent prayer was offered by one of the brothers in thanksgiving for their many blessings. Then each family entered its own wagon and retired for the night. 2 guards remained on duty while the company slept. They were so spent, however, that weariness overcame them. As the night wore on, first one, then the other leaned against the wagon, gradually slipping to the ground as sleep descended upon them. It was never known exactly how the slow, clumsy oxen found or made an opening through the corral, or whether it was made for them, but they escaped and strayed away. The loss was not discovered until the next morning. The men snatched only a hurried bite before galloping off to search for them. Many were found not far from the camp, but it was soon evident that others had strayed into the hills and must be searched for in earnest. The women were glad for the delay. It meant they could bake bread and catch up on washing and cooking. But first, they must prepare breakfast for their children and themselves. One woman, whose husband had been drowned in the La Platte River earlier in the journey, came to the Millses' wagon. "I wonder, Sister Mills," she asked, addressing Sarah's mother, "if Sarah might come and mind my children while I make our breakfast." "Of course she can. Sarah, dear, take Carrie with you and go help Mrs. Owen with her children. I can manage here if you take the baby." "Yes, Mother." Leading her little sister by the hand, Sarah hurried to the Owens' wagon. She could not help noticing as she climbed into it how much poorer this family must be than her own. Cotton batting was bulging through the threadbare quilts on the bed. The 3 children, huddled together in the center, had a pinched, hungry look on their faces. "Sit down on the floor, Tim, and I'll make up the bed. Then we'll all sit on it, and I'll tell you a story." Swiftly and deftly, she set the camp wagon in order. Then, gathering the children about her, she began. "Once upon a time, there was a man." Outside, the busy pioneer mothers had breakfast well underway. Suddenly, with no warning, there descended upon the camp, from the ravine, a band of 20 or more young Indian braves on horseback. They rode through the camp, screaming and yelling, upsetting the kettles of food, putting out fires, and snatching whatever pleased them. Waving tomahawks and knives, they chilled with dumb terror the defenseless women and children. "Lie down flat in the wagon bed and don't make any noise. Then they won't even know we're here," whispered Sarah to the terrified children. "Don't even breathe out loud." But little Jenny Owen caught a glimpse of the painted braves. She shrieked aloud, "Mama! I want my mama!" "Hush! For pity's sakes, Jenny! Be still! They'll hear you!" Sarah clapped her hand over the child's mouth. Too late. The chief himself heard the baby scream. His bronze-painted face was framed for an instant in the oval opening at the back of the wagon. Then he reached in as he sat on his horse and jerked the 2 children nearest him out onto the ground. Sarah saw his long, naked arm coming in once more, this time toward tiny Jenny, who had been galvanized into silence by his presence. A new fierce anger took the place of fear in Sarah as he tried to pull the child from her. Swiftly, she snatched up the oxbow at her feet and cracked him sharply across the knuckles. This was the first sign of resistance any of the company had shown. Instead of angering the young chief, it drew his admiration. "Brave squaw! Brave little white squaw!" he cried. At the same instant, releasing the child, he swung Sarah herself from the wagon and onto his horse, holding her in front of him in a grip of steel. So swift had been the transition that none in the camp realized what had taken place until they saw the chief signal his men and gallop off up the ravine. With all her young strength, Sarah fought for her freedom. She twisted this way and that in his cruel grip, trying vainly to free her arms. The horse sped on, followed by the others, as she battled hopelessly. Gladly would she have thrown them both from the horse and been trampled to death by the oncoming riders, rather than be their captive. Once she very nearly unseated her captor as the horse swung to the left up the winding trail. "Be still, white squaw," he commanded angrily, tightening his hold until her very bones seemed to crack. She could neither move nor breathe. Her face was pressed against his great chest. The only weapon she had now was her teeth. With her last shred of remaining strength, she pressed her mouth against him and sank her teeth into his bare flesh. A white man might surely have lost his grip at such sudden and unexpected pain, but not the Indian. True, he relaxed his hold for a second, but then tightened it more viciously than before, and Sarah slipped into unconsciousness from lack of breath. The Indians were all young braves, robust and fresh. Some, including the chief, had stolen horses, much larger and swifter than the regular Indian ponies. For perhaps an hour, they urged their horses on at a full gallop. Then, fearing pursuit no longer, they slackened their speed. When Sarah again opened her eyes, she found that her position had been changed to a more comfortable one. Her head was pillowed on the man's chest, but her cheek had become glued there by the drying blood, oozing from the wound she had inflicted. She lay cradled in his arms across the front of his horse. For a moment, as her senses cleared, she lay perfectly still. Then, remembering her predicament, a new flood of terror swept through her. The large beads of perspiration on his chest formed into tiny rivulets and ran down to mingle with caked blood against her cheek. As the odor of it penetrated her nostrils, she jerked her head free and tried again to escape. The Indian winced with sudden pain, and fresh blood trickled from the teeth marks. But he was on the alert, and her struggles amused rather than angered him. Afterward, when she thought of that terrible ride, she wondered that he had shown no great anger toward her because of the cruel bite. But now she neither noticed nor cared that he seemed to wish to show that he admired her because she had defied him. Fear, as she realized her position, and hatred toward her captor were the only emotions of which she was conscious at the moment. "White squaw, wake up," he grinned down at her. There was possessiveness in his smile that she shrank from, even though she could not comprehend its meaning. "No can get away," he added gruffly, as her hands clawed at him in desperation. He caught her two wrists in one hand, while with the other he urged the horse to gallop on. After what seemed hours to her, they rode into a great clearing where hundreds of little tents were pitched. Indian squaws were preparing food for their men. When they caught sight of the returning braves, they ran forward to inspect the booty. With a silent sweep of his hand, the chief waved them back. Then gently he lifted Sarah to the ground and ordered food to be brought. She had eaten nothing since the night before. The long ride, the excitement, and her unbroken fast were too much. She swayed and would have fallen had not the chief caught her. He carried her to a tent and laid her on a pile of buffalo skins that were heaped upon the floor. Then he strode out, leaving her alone. She was so numb with weariness and faint from hunger that she did not even notice the filth of the Indian abode. When a flat, middle-aged squaw came in only 5 minutes later with a bowl of steaming soup, the girl was sound asleep. Near sundown, she awoke. The fat squaw returned and offered her a wooden bowl filled with steaming stew. Earlier in the day, Sarah had sworn to herself that rather than live with the Indians, she would die of starvation. "I won't touch a mouthful of food or drink," she vowed. Taking the proffered bowl, she threw it as far as her strength permitted through the open flap of the tent. "I won't stay here and live," she cried passionately. "I'd rather die, be tortured to death, than belong to you filthy Indians. I won't eat, you can't make me. I'll starve. I want to starve." Defiantly, she glared back at the chief as he stepped noiselessly into the tent. He came straight toward her. He was taller than she had realized. Now that she saw him apart from his horse, she knew that never until this moment had she seen such a perfect specimen of manhood. Attired only in loincloth and girdle, his long black hair hanging loosely behind his ears, he looked like a bronze giant to the little pioneer maiden. He moved with the easy grace of a mountain lion, and reminded her of one as he advanced. The squaw withdrew as he approached, leaving the two alone in the tent. It was not large. Now only the heap of skins lay between them. Never in her life before had Sarah known such fear. He paused briefly, folding his arms across his chest. His piercing black eyes traveled slowly over her, missing nothing. There was something of the savage, something of the male, something she could not fathom, in the mystery of his gaze. All color drained from her face, while about her lips there arose a white, corded outline that had never been there before, and yet, unconsciously, the proud arch of her neck held her head high and unbowed. Her great blue eyes stared back into his snapping black ones. He was standing directly between her and the door of the tent. He drew a deep breath. She shrank back, quivering but upright, her eyes never leaving his face. Then, suddenly, with his moccasined foot, He kicked the barrier of skins to one side and closed the distance between them. Her hands clenched to her sides. She stood rigid, defiant, trembling. Her breath came in short, uneven gasps. "What do you want?" she choked. All the tales she had ever heard of Indians were those of torture and bloodshed. Dimly, she remembered hearing that they killed their male victims, but the women they often kept alive. A fate worse than death were the words her mother had used. She was trembling now, from head to foot, but she drew herself up proudly, eyes defiant, despite her fear. How she wished he would kill her, now, this minute. Perhaps if I can provoke him to sudden anger, she thought, he might do it. Then it would be over. As his hands reached out to take her, she ducked beneath them and leaped for the door. But swifter than light, he wheeled and swept her up from the ground, holding her in those steel arms in an embrace that seemed to crush out her very life. The anger she hoped to invoke was written on every line of his stern features, making them seem savage and cruel. His eyes blazed with a light that turned her very blood to ice. Still the death blow did not fall. Gradually the anger faded from his countenance. He sank with her still in his arms, down upon the skins. "No go, little squaw," he whispered hoarsely. "Stay here. Be my squaw. No run away." "I won't stay here," she tried to free herself. "Let me go. I hate you. I hate you. Kill me if you want to. I want you to kill me." She could struggle no longer. Sobs, the first she had given way to, shook her so that speech became impossible. Gently he tried to soothe her. He rearranged the skins and sat with her head in his arms, her body resting full length beside him. His fingers began playing with the heavy red gold braid of hair. Time and time again he pulled it slowly through one with the other. Presently, as she grew quiet, he reached into his girdle and drew from it a piece of polished brown bark. It was about the size of his palm. Through one corner a bit of red cloth had been drawn through a tiny hole bored there. He bent, his gaze full upon her, as he proffered this strange gift. Here was a primitive male wooing his mate. With every trace of anger gone from his handsome features, he seemed almost civilized by the look of tenderness and longing that crept into his eyes. Sarah did not know what he meant by offering her the bark. But she felt less afraid, for she sensed he meant only kindness in what he did. She would have taken it rather than again invoke his anger, for she felt conquered and beaten, knowing that alone she could never hope to escape. However, outside there was a sudden wild commotion, rudely interrupting the drama in the tent, so that before she had time to take or reject the bark, the chief leaped to his feet, pulling her up with him. Thrusting it back into his girdle, he stepped outside, dragging her with him. Sarah's heart gave a wild leap, and instinctively she sprang forward, only to be jerked rudely back by the Indian. "Father!" she cried. "Father, here I am!" For every able-bodied man in the Mormon company rode behind John Mills as he headed the procession, waving a white flag on the point of his rifle. Directly behind him rode Charles Oakes. Sarah noted the look of murderous hatred he shot at her captor. But the chief's eyes were on her father. An awkward move at this time might mean the lives of all the company. She quaked inwardly at the thought. The restless braves pranced like horses held at bay, waiting only their chief's signal to fill with arrows these white intruders whose scalps they already coveted. But he waved them back with a fierce gesture, then advanced alone with his captive toward the horsemen and their flag of truce. Sarah watched her father dismount, fear tearing at her heart lest some brave dared disobey the chief and shoot him down. The chief stopped, letting her father advance, but his grip on her wrist never slackened. When her father stood before them, the chief turned again to Sarah and, drawing out the bark, held it out to her in the sight of all his people and hers. Her father's voice rang out in quick alarm. "Don't touch that, Sarah. If you do, nothing we can do or say will save you. You will belong to him. It is an offering of marriage. By accepting it, you automatically become his squaw." Then, turning to the chief without a second's hesitation, he drew from his shirt his great gold watch. A tiny key dangled from one end of the chain. He held the prize temptingly before the chief, allowing it to swing ever so gently back and forth in the fading light. "I come in peace, O chief," he addressed the Indian. "See, I offer you this. I want to buy back my daughter. It is magic. It will talk to you." He came a step closer and pressed the watch against the chief's ear. Then stepping back, he continued, "It can talk. It can sing. I will make it sing for you." It was plain he had aroused the chief's interest. He was quick to enlarge upon the impression he had made. Taking the key, he inserted it into the back of the watch and wound it carefully. Again, he held it close to the chief's ear, releasing the tiny spring with his thumb as he did so, thus setting off the alarm. The Indian jumped back in surprised delight. Never before had he seen anything to compare with this metal disc that had a voice. 2 voices, in fact, one that whispered and one that sang. It was new, different. He liked it very much. He wanted it for his own. Still, he had gone to considerable trouble to kidnap the girl. He did not intend to give her up lightly. Slowly, he shook his head. "Come to our camp, then. We will give you food. Sugar, flour, anything we have." "Yeah, we go your camp. Get food, much food. Then you keep White Squaw. I keep Magic Song." He allowed Sarah to ride back with her father. He gathered his own men, and the return journey began. Midnight had struck when they rode into the Mormon camp. The saints were clustered about a huge bonfire, anxiously awaiting their return. As he dismounted, Mills addressed them. "The Indians are willing to sell Sarah back to us if we can meet their terms. I offered them my watch, but they want more. Those of you who feel you can spare some of your food supplies, bring them at once." The Indians spread 2 buffalo robes on the ground near the fire. Every family gave of their precious store. Sugar, rice, tea, salt, dried fruit, and meat, all were laid upon the robes. The greedy Indians pressed closer and closer as the piles increased. "More, more," they demanded. "We will starve before reaching the valley if we give another thing," exclaimed Mills. "We must do something, and do it quick." "I have it," exclaimed Oakes. He whispered earnestly into Mills's ear. "Yes, go quickly. Fire them both." The scout slid out of the sight of the crowd, then ran with all his strength toward the Mills's wagon. During the night, the older men had set up 2 cannons that were being taken across the plains by their company for President Brigham Young at his request. Though they had never before had occasion to use them, they set them up every night when they camped, as a precautionary measure to frighten off marauding Indians. Oakes fired them both in quick succession. The unexpected roar seemed to shake the very earth. The Indians were terrified. The noise, together with the great bolts of fire that shot into the sky, had the desired effect. They stopped only long enough to snatch up the provisions, then galloped madly away as though the devil himself pursued them. And that's it for Chapter 1. I'd love to hear your thoughts so far, so feel free to comment down below this video. I hope you have a happy Pioneer Day, and I'll see you next week for Chapter 2.